to Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6 if we could. And I just want to talk a little bit about the faithfulness of God, and that faithfulness is different to faith, of course, but it is a very high virtue, and it's really valued in the sight of God and also in the sight of man. And in verse 6 of Philippians chapter 1, it says, "Being confident of this very thing, that he which has begun the good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ." And it's not as though God fills us with the Holy Spirit when we ask, and he's completely committed to the relationship to take it through to completion and perfection. And the only wobbly bit, of course, is ourselves, but God is completely faithful, and he doesn't get halfway through the project, you and I, and think, oh, this isn't working, and then just sort of throw us in a ditch sort of thing. But he's begun a good work, and he's prepared to stick with it and to be faithful the whole way through. And I guess the Bible teaches us that there's times in our life, and in Ecclesiastes it says there's a time to be born, there's a time to die, time to laugh, and a time to gather stones and throw stones away, a time of love and hate and all sorts of things. And there's definite times in our life, and I guess if you look at it, that things progress, and I guess for those that get married, you start off courting somebody and you fall in love and it's all wonderful, and then you have the honeymoon and everything's great, and it's completely different. You get 10 years down the track and things are completely different because kids have probably come along, you've got mortgages, financial pressure, and it's different. But the big thing is to stick with it and to be faithful the whole way through, because times change, and you can't lock yourself in this sort of bubble of time, because everything is subject to change. And we need to really tap into this faithfulness side of things, because it is a high virtue and it does come from above. We might go to 2 Kings. We'll go to 2 Kings, chapter 20. Now this is a time, Bible teaches us that everything that happened in the Old Testament is some sort of teaching and analogy for us. It's definite events that happened to God's people in history, and it's brought forward and it's recorded here, and we can get something from it. A lot of the times it's a bit of a metaphor or a principle which we can get from it. And this is quite an interesting story. This is 1 Kings, and the background to this is that this was in the time of Ahab, and he was a notorious king of the northern tribe of Israel, and they didn't walk with God. They actually worshipped idols, and he had his wife Jezebel, and she was a piece of work, and they had the prophets of Baal there, and it was a time of Elijah. Most of you know the period that I'm talking about, and this is something that happened in his time. And Ahab, he actually repented somewhere along the way, and God had mercy upon him. And but this is just a story about God's people at that time. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 20, and we'll pick it up in verse 21. Now, the Syrians had come against the northern parts of Israel and the house of Israel. And Ben-Hadad, he was a king, and he brought another 32 kings with him and a great host, a great army. And that's a lot of people, and they come down upon the land. And they had a battle, and it was in the high country, in the hill country. And in verse 21 it says, "And the king of Israel went out and smote the horses and the chariots and slew the Syrians with a great slaughter. And the prophet came to the king of Israel and said unto him, Go, strengthen thyself, and mark and see what thou doest, for at the return of the year the king of Syria will come up against thee again." So you've had this victory, but there's a bit of a warning here that you got to rearm, because he's going to come back. And in verse 23, "And the servants of the king of Syria said unto him, Their gods are gods of the hills, therefore they were stronger than we, but let us fight again in them in the plain, and surely we shall be stronger than they, and do this, take the kings away." They had 32 kings, and obviously there was a lot of conflicting sort of leadership. Too many cooks spoil the broth sort of thing, and replace them. and every man out of his place, and put captains in their room, and then we'll get victory, because their God is a God of the hill country and the mountains, but he's rubbish in the plain. And that's what their thinking was. And in verse 25, and number thee an army, like the army of the which thou hast lost, horse for horse, chariot for chariot, and we will fight against them in the plain, and surely we shall be stronger than they. And he hearkened unto their voice, and did so. And it came to pass at the return of the year that Ben-Hadad numbered the Syrians, and went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. And the children of Israel were numbered, and were all present, and went out against them. And the children of Israel pitched before them like two little flocks of kids, but the Syrians filled the country. So they're fighting now in the plains, in the low country, in the valleys, and Israel's there. It's like two little flocks there, and a great host, a great army of the Syrians around them, and they're in trouble, they're in dire straits. Verse 28, and there came a man of God and spake unto the king of Israel, and said, Thus saith the Lord, because the Syrians had said, the Lord is a God of the hills, but he is not of the God of the valleys. Therefore will I deliver all this great multitude into thy hand, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. And they pitched one over against another 7 days, and so it was that in the seventh day the battle was joined, and the children of Israel slew the Syrians, 100,000 footmen in one day, but the rest fled to Aphek unto the city, and there a wall fell upon them, 27,000 of the men that were left. And Ben-Hadad fled. So there was a great victory wrought. And it wasn't because of the righteousness of Ahab or anything like that the Lord went into battle, because it was just the arrogance of the Syrians. And they said, well, God is a God of the mountains, but he can't do what he does in the valleys. Now, the old pagan idol worshippers, they had pretty much gods for everything. They had gods for the sea and gods for the sky, the underworld, gods for war and peace and every day of the week. And they had gods of the mountains and gods in the valley, and you had to tap into the right God at the right occasion to get the right outcome. And they didn't recognize the sovereignty or the authority of God, that he is strong in the mountains, but he is also equally strong in the valleys. And I guess we can turn this into a metaphor of our life, really, that there's going to be times in our life when we're going to feel like we're up on the mountains and everything's good. You know, we might be in a sort of fellowship situation surrounded by good people. We're carried along by that and everything is just wonderful. But then times change, and we might find ourselves in a situation where we've really got to press in, knuckle down. We've got all these things which are coming against us, and we can sort of get into the frame of mind, well, God can perform in that situation when I'm feeling right and I'm surrounded by all this stuff. But when I'm by myself and feeling vulnerable, God can't perform. And that is not correct, because God is a God that does it on the mountains, he does it in the valleys, all throughout whatever we experience in this life. Now, I'd like to take you to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and it gives us a bit of advice. In verse 10, it says, say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. So the good old days, and it was better back in my day, 20 plus years ago. It was all different and things were a lot better back then. Well, we're actually being pretty foolish by doing that, because the days were probably not better at all. And sometimes we can relate that to our walk in the Lord, that when we first come to the Lord, we sort of got a series of big prayers answered and miracles, and maybe we had a sick body and the Lord turned that around, and all sorts of wonderful things happened back then. And the reason why, and then we get 10, 20 plus years down the track and we think it was better back then. But what happened was we underwent really big change in virtually the moment of time, which is what the born again experience is about. It's about change. It is about a rebirth. It is about a new birth. So of course everything's going to be new. It's going to be fresh. We're going to, like our brain, to try and understand it all, take it all in. We start to soak in the Word of God. We learn to pray, and we get all this wonderful things starts to happen in our life. And then we get 10 years down the track, bit like the marriage, we're dealing with stuff, but we've got the relationship. And that's the thing, being faithful the whole way through. And we won't see the same degree of change. And we can sometimes look back with rose-coloured glasses and think, back then, that was the mountains. And God could perform back then, but he's not much over here. Well, that is wrong thinking. Hebrews chapter 13, it talks about the Lord. It says that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That God is not given to change. And even the stuff we read in the New Testament, it still applies today. And if we tap in, we approach God in the same way, we get the same answers today. That nothing has changed because God is not subject to change. If we can go over to Psalm 46. Psalm 46. Now, even in the New Testament, there's a feature in the Gospel of John where Jesus uses a series of I ams. He uses 7 different I ams, and he takes that title, I am the bread of life, I'm the light of the world, and that sort of thing, and he applies it to himself. And there's history to that statement, goes back to the book of Exodus, and when Moses was called through the burning bush and they had this conversation, who am I going to say you are? What's your name? And the Lord said, I am. And it's not I was or I will be, but it is I am, and it is the ever-present God. And Psalm 46 and verse 1 to 2 teaches us this. We'll read it. It says, God is our refuge, our safe place, our high tower, and strength, and a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. And we've got this peace within. We're not overtaken by fear, and sometimes we've got no idea what's going to happen as far as world events from here. If we were living now back 100 years ago, we would have been staring down the barrel of another world war, and we would be heading into the Great Depression and all these really big events, life-changing events sort of thing. And we can go through this and we're not overtaken by fear. Why? Because we've got this relationship with God, and he's our very present help in trouble. And I think we all need to understand that, and praise the Lord, we do get it, and we just learn to start trusting the Lord. I want to take you over to Job chapter 42. It's a really interesting book, Job. Most of us would know it, and if you've ever got that question, why do bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people and all that, well, if you're looking for answers, maybe you'll get some sort of understanding here in the book of Job. It starts off, most of us would know the story, and Job, he was a righteous man, he walked with God, he did everything right, seemingly. And in a moment of time, he lost all his possessions, his family was taken away, and then the real kicker after that was he lost his health, and he's sitting down amongst the ashes and he's scraping the boils, and the Bible would indicate that he was actually fly blown. There were maggots in his skin and all this sort of thing, and I don't think you could get to a lower point, any of us, in this life than what Job was at. So he goes through this horrible time, and then his 3 frenemies come. Friend enemies, they were friends, but they come along and actually put the boot in. They give him a good kicking and saying that these things only happen to bad peoples and sinners, Job, and that must be you. What they said was right, but their application to Job was wrong. It didn't apply to Job. and they didn't really know the full backstory. Anyway, they got it horribly wrong. And then we get this man Elihu come, and he's a young man, and he speaks a lot of truth. And he identifies there was a certain amount of error in Job, that he'd been a really diligent person trying to follow the Lord, and he took upon that as like some sort of status with God, that I do this, therefore I am worthy, or whatever, and we'd probably call it self-righteousness. And finally, right at the end of about chapter 38, so we've gone through 38 chapters of toing and froing and all this stuff bouncing around, and then the Lord appears to Job and he speaks to him from a whirlwind. And for the next couple of chapters, he just virtually says, well, where were you, Job? I put everything together, I made everything, and you wouldn't even backchat or give lip to one of the animals that I created. And here you are, you're sort of lifting yourself up. And then we read the outcome of Job after this. So Job 42, and we'll just read in perhaps verse 1. It says, Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou can doest everything, and that no thought or no purpose that God has can be withholden from thee. So I recognize, God, that you are the sovereign, and that I am just the creation and I'm not the creator, and there are a lot of things that I'm never going to understand. And I think, and there was no actual answers given to Job. He wasn't explained the backstory. Now we get the backstory that the accuser of the brethren, the one who does mischief sort of thing, was putting things out there and sort of getting this sort of competition thing going. That is this man really righteous? And he was not explained that backstory that was happening. And I believe Job's trials and the answer came in the outcome. And the outcome was that he walked away with double blessing. And I believe we've got to come to the point where we realise that God is the manager, and you leave the management to the manager. And we learn to trust, and whatever happens, realise that God is faithful. He's with us, and he's with us in the mountains, and he's with us in the valleys. And the answer came to Job in that he got twice as much as he had before, and he lived to a really big age. And the blessing came, and that is the answer. That maybe there might be these difficulties that we go through, but if we hold fast to the Lord, he's ever merciful. And he always meets us with mercy and abundance, and there's a saying that you can't outgive God, and that is so true, and the Lord will always bless. But Job was a very faithful person, and he put a lot of faith in God, and it's recorded for our benefit. And what a benefit it is, He's got some great words that he said in Job 13 verse 15. He actually said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And he said that while he was sitting in the ashes scraping his skin. And you've got to be and to just sort of condense that down and put it in a book so that we could read this and we could get encouragement here and now. I think that's amazing, and that we've got the answer to these things that sometimes come our way. All right, now I want to look at somebody in the scriptures, and that is King David. So if we can go to 2 Samuel chapter 15. And this is the story of King David. And if you ever want to read an action-packed story, it's one of King David. He probably lived about 20 lives in his one life, and had so much amazing things happen, had a lot of near-death experiences. He's on the run, and next minute he's the head of the army. The king's son-in-law, he faces off, he defeats a giant, and he's got this real sort of roller coaster of the life. He's got these dizzy highs, and then he's got these crushing lows, and we read about him in the cave, and he's in desperate situations, he's on the run. And this is just one of the events that happened in David's life. So we're in 2 Samuel and chapter 15. Pick it up in verse 13. Now, he's actually on the mountain at this point in time. Everything is good. He's established as king of Israel, all the 12 tribes, and the enemies are defeated, and he's got the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem. He's got Zion, the stronghold of David. He's camped up there, and there's seemingly peace in the kingdom at that time. But that was about to change big time. So we're in chapter 15 and verse 13. And there came a messenger to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. Now, Absalom was one of his sons. He was a really good looking guy, and he'd sought to undermine David's authority and credibility for about 4 years prior to this, and he'd slowly whittled away. And he gathered momentum, and there was a lot of people following him, and he was about to overthrow David so he could take the throne. And in verse 14, and David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for we shall not escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servants said unto the king, behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king will appoint thee, And we'll just skip over to verse 23. So they're on the run. David's got his tail between his legs, and he's taken quite a group from Jerusalem, and they're fleeing because Absalom's coming. In verse 23, and all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook of Kidron, and all the people passed over towards the way of the wilderness. Now, Kidron, there's a couple of little sort of valleys that surround Jerusalem. Jerusalem's pretty high, apparently. I've never been there, but you read about it, and it's like these sort of pinnacles up there, and it's got these valleys. One's Kidron, I think the other's Hinnon. And so he crossed the brook of Kidron, and that's on the way out, and that's on the way down to Jericho Way to cross the Jordan. And Kidron actually means, it comes from the Hebrew word, and it means dark and shady. So tail between his legs, and he's going through this dark and shady place, and like he's on the run. And this isn't a good place. Now, he was heading down to the valley. He was already in the valley, and he was heading even lower because he's going to go down to the Jordan Valley, and that's an extension to the Rift Valley, and that's the lowest place on earth. So that is the valley of all valleys on the earth, and he's heading down there, and the Bible records that he crossed over the Jordan. So he goes from the mountain, everything's peachy in Jerusalem, and he's heading down to the lowest place he can actually get to. Now, we've got wonderful benefit and insight into David because he wrote most of the Psalms, and whatever he was going through, he generally would put pen to paper and record a psalm. And they're written for us and written for our benefit. So I want to take you over to Psalm chapter 3. Now, this was written at this time, so we get an insight into the first person thinking. This is David himself putting pen to paper when he was on the run from Absalom. And we'll read his words. Psalm chapter 3, it said, Lord, how art they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. And actually on the way out of the valley of Kidron, this guy was up on the higher cleft. He was a descendant of Saul, and he was actually throwing rocks at David, and he was cursing him and calling him a son of the devil and all sorts of stuff. So to add insult to injury, he's already on the run, and he's got this guy sort of bad-mouthing him. And in verse 3 it says, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me. And that is one of the promises that came to Abraham and those that are of faith, that God is a shield to us, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried unto the Lord with my voice. He called upon the Lord in prayer, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Selah. I laid me down and slept, and I awake, for the Lord sustained me. And he was able to sleep at this difficult time. Why is that? Because he trusted in God. He had a faith in God, and it took him through. And verse 6, and I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, that thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone, and thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord, and blessing is upon thy people. So in this time of great distress, going down to the valley, God was very present with him, and it wasn't as though God's rubbish in the valley, he's forsaken me. No, I'm going down to the valley, and God's with me, and inside there was probably a peace, and there was a quietness. Now, I'll take you over the page, a couple of pages over to Psalm 23. Some Bible commentators reckon that this was recorded at the same time. I don't know, maybe not. But in verse 4, this is a well-known psalm, of course, and it says, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And he saw and he realised that he was just passing through here. And he wasn't going to be fearful, that the fear was taken away. Now, our brother Greg checked out, and we had a memorial yesterday, and through the years I've had an association with people when they're about to pass away. And there's a time to be born, time to die, and the thing is, when we wear a mortal body, it's coming, and it comes to everybody that wears a mortal body. And it can also be likened to this valley of the shadow of death, that the shadows of death are upon us. But I believe, and I've noticed it with good saints through the years, that there's been no fear about what is coming. There's no uncertainty. There's no it's taken away, because they've got a relationship with God, and they realise that thou art with me. And there is no sting in death, for the believer, those that walk with the Lord. And I believe we can have confidence in that. And I guess that is the ultimate valley for everybody who's to wear a body in this life. All right, well, we'll go to Psalm 48 if we can. So just as much as David experienced the valleys, he also experienced the mountains, and we've got a record of his writings when everything was good, when he was in that really good place, and just everything was right, if you like. And Psalm 48, and in verse 1, it says, Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth, is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. God is known in her palaces for a refuge. And it talks about the mountain of God, this place where communion was had with God, because the testimony, the ark of God was there. And this was a mountain, this was a dwelling place of David. And the Bible teaches us in James 5 and verse 13, it says, Is any afflicted among you? Pray. And is any merry? Sing psalms. So we know how to rejoice, and we know how in affliction we pray. So we're able to function on the mountain, but also in the valley, and David could certainly do that. We'll go to Psalm 122, and we'll read some of his words as well. Psalm 122 and verse 1. It says, I was glad when they said unto me, Let us go unto the house of the Lord. So this gave him joy when someone said to him, Come on, let's go unto that God's house. Our feet shall stand within thy gates, O Jerusalem. And Jerusalem represents the church. It represents fellowship with God for us in the New Testament, where we come together. Verse 3, Jerusalem is builded as a city that is compacted together. Verse 4, whither the tribes go up, and the tribes of the Lord. So those that have common belief, Israel, those ruling with God, God's people, that they come together and they go to this place unto the testimony of Israel. It's actually talking about the Ark of the Covenant, the very presence of God, which was in the tabernacle at that point in time, and they would go to that place to direct their prayers, and no doubt to encourage one another, to give thanks unto the name of the Lord. For there are set thrones of judgment, thrones of the house of David. Pray for peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee. Peace be within thy walls and prosperity within thy palaces. For my brethren and companions' sake, I will now say, peace be within thee, because of the house of the Lord our God, and I will seek good. So Jerusalem, the city of peace, and it's been anything but there's another spiritual Jerusalem, and the Bible talks about that. And it talks about that the church basically is the new Jerusalem, and it gives us that, and that is a mother of us all, if you like. And this is a place that we come to and rejoiced in his heart. Let's go to fellowship and be with like-minded people, and let's go into the presence of God. And for you and I, brothers and sisters, the Bible talks about it in the book of Corinthians, chapter 12 onwards. It talks about when we come together, the Spirit divides amongst us, and there's ministry that happens. There's communication that happens from above when we come together. We don't come together, we don't get that, and we need that. So this was a mountain that David would like to go to. Now, just another sort of metaphor, I guess the world at the moment is a very troubled place. It's never been better for us in first world countries, as far as food and clothing and toys and beads and shiny mirrors and that sort of thing. We've got all that, but it is a troubled place for the righteous, those that want to follow the Lord and those that to walk in his ways. And we read the news and we see what's happening, and it's just like going down by the day. But the Bible teaches us this in 2 Timothy 3 onwards. It says, but evil men and deceivers will get worse and worse in the last days, perilous times, because of the behaviour, the nature of the people. And in comparison to what is coming, this is a valley. And for you and I guess we're able to function in this valley. We're able to tap into the strength that God is our refuge. But in comparison to what is coming, this is definitely going to seem like a valley. Not that we've got a crushing life or anything like that in the natural. We haven't in the natural. Things have never been better. But on a spiritual level and a value level, it's a pretty dark, shady place. So we'll go to Isaiah, because this is what the Bible talks about. This is what we're looking for. And it says that the people of faith in the Old Testament, that they looked for, Abraham, he looked for a city who had a maker and foundation. A foundation and a maker was God, that God lived in that city. And that's what he was looking for. A place, a dwelling place, but most importantly, God's got to be there. So this is what's coming. This is prophecy at this stage. It hasn't happened. Isaiah chapter 2 and in verse 2, it says, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. And at the moment, we've got the ways of man and we've got the paths of man. But there's going to come a time when even those outside a covenant with God, or whatever, the Gentile nations, they're going to see the blessing of God, and they're going to want it, and they're going to make the journey to the presence of God. And and they'll see value in the ways of God. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. That's definitely not happening at the moment. The budget for nations, what they're spending on the military is going up and up. Shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord. So this is what's coming. And even in the book of Daniel, we get that great prophecy, the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, the image, the metal image, the kingdoms of men. And then the stone that was made without hands crashes into the image. It falls to the ground, and it's just forgotten, turns to dust. And the stone becomes a great mountain, which fills the whole earth. Now, we've learned to walk with the Lord in the valley, and God's with us in the valley, and he will certainly be with us in the mountain. And we might say amen, and we're going to hand over to Clifton now for communion.